What would he be basing that on after what you've seen in the past couple of days?
I think he's probably overdoing it here, as Trump often does. We don't yet know whether we are near the finish line, whether there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Trump, broadly speaking, is doing the right thing by reaching out to Putin, by starting a dialogue between Washington and Moscow, because this war won't end without that dialogue. But I have to say the overall negotiations have been handled chaotically. He's sort of gone over the heads of the Ukrainians straight to the Russians to try to strike a deal. He really ought to do his homework first, talk to the Ukrainians, talk to the European allies, get a game plan, and then start negotiating with the Russians. So it's very difficult to tell where we are now because the rollout of this effort has been such a mess.
When you say, Charles, that there would be no way to end the war without a dialogue, do you mean a dialogue specifically that involves the U.S., or there just has to be a dialogue mediated by some third-party country? Because the U.S., at least through J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio this week, has suggested they may soon be walking away.
Well, both. I think you have to have a U.S.-Russia dialogue, and you have to have a Ukraine-Russia dialogue. But in the end of the day, I think what is really interesting Putin is his relationship with Trump. The idea that Trump can bring him in from the cold, bring him back in and put him at the table with other major powers, bring down the U.S. sanctions. So there needs to be a direct Washington-Moscow channel here, but that has to be embedded in a broader diplomatic landscape. And that's where I think Trump has probably made his biggest mistakes, dealing with the Ukrainians and with the Europeans almost as an afterthought, when the bottom line here is that Trump can't get a deal without Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine, saying, yes, I agree to this. So right now, I think things are still very uncertain. We don't even know the real terms of the deal that Witkoff seems to be negotiating with Putin. So it's very difficult to tell at this point whether this is a chance, whether we really have a serious chance here of getting a ceasefire and an end to the war.
Charles, Volodymyr Zelenskyy today acknowledged that Ukrainian forces on their own would not be able to retake Crimea. I wonder what you make of the significance of this comment, if it's an evolution on what Zelenskyy thinks about his own military's ability, or an acknowledgement that the U.S. would not likely help him to that end.
Well, I think, the best element of the status of negotiations that we have today is that the Russians have said we are ready to agree to a ceasefire in place. And in the end of the day, that's probably the best that Ukrainians are going to be able to do, because Russia has more manpower, bigger economy, bigger military industrial base. Ukraine is not going to take back Crimea and those parts of eastern Ukraine occupied by Russia by force. But whether this is a good deal for Ukraine or not really depends upon aspects of the agreement that remain quite opaque. Is Putin ready to accept that the 80% of Ukraine that is still run by Kyiv, that is still free, will be a success story, a going concern, able to rebuild its military, able to get arms from the West? If the answer to that is yes, and Putin can live with a successful democratic Ukraine anchored in Russia, I think Zelenskyy should sign off tonight. But Putin has over the past said, I want a demilitarized Ukraine. I want regime change. Is he still going to ask for that?
Well, and when we consider that remaining 80% of Ukraine, what's to say he wouldn't go in and try to take more of that share if he's guaranteed that Ukraine can never be part of NATO?
Well, that's precisely why we need to know whether, as part of the negotiations with Putin, the United States is ensuring that that part of Ukraine that is still run by Ukrainians will be free to defend itself, will be free to rebuild its army, will be free to enter the European Union, i.e., will be a success story. And until we have those sorts of details about Ukraine's ability to make its own choices and prepare to defend itself for Russia against the long haul, it's very difficult to judge whether this is a good deal for Ukraine or whether this is just Putin buying time to ultimately continue his effort to subjugate Ukraine and pull it back into Russia's sphere of influence.